In the whole of recorded history, no political system has ever proven harder to kill than the Roman Republic. It survived 200 years of near-continuous war. It survived a Carthaginian general crossing the Alps with war elephants and slaughtering 70,000 Roman soldiers in a single afternoon at Cannae. It survived famine, plague, slave revolts, and the open sea. Every enemy who came for it left Rome stronger than they found it. For 5 centuries, it was the most resilient governing machine the ancient world had ever produced. And then one man crossed a shallow river in northern Italy with a single legion, and it was gone. His name was Julius Caesar, and what he unleashed could not be put back. What followed was not a dictatorship imposed by force, nor a republic that simply fell apart. It was something stranger and more consequential than either. The Roman Empire, built in secret by a young man named Augustus, wearing the old republic's face. Caesar broke something he could not fix. Augustus fixed it by insisting, to his dying breath, that nothing had ever been broken at all. This is the story of the death of the greatest republic in history, and the cold, brilliant birth of an empire that would shape the next 2,000 years. In 509 BC, the Romans threw out their king. His name was Tarquin the Proud, and the story told about why he was expelled was the kind of story Romans needed to believe. A tale of arrogance and violation so total that the only answer was revolution. Whether that version was precisely true hardly mattered. What mattered was what came next. The Romans, having rid themselves of a monarch, were determined never to have one again. And so they built something designed, from its very foundations, to make monarchy impossible. They called it the res publica, the public thing, the common affair, the business of the Roman people. It was not a democracy in the way the Greeks understood the word. The average Roman farmer did not govern himself and knew it. But the Republic was something genuinely new in the world. A system in which power was distributed across so many offices, so many institutions, and so many overlapping authorities that no single man could ever hold enough of it to become dangerous. That was the design. That was the intention. For nearly 5 centuries, with all its imperfections, it largely held. At the summit of the whole structure sat the 2 consuls. Every year, 2 men were elected to hold the highest executive office in the Roman world. They commanded the armies, presided over the Senate, administered the law, and represented Rome in its dealings with foreign powers. Their authority was vast, their prestige almost sacred, and yet each of them could veto the other. The moment one consul overreached, his colleague could say a single word, "Veto, I forbid," and the action stopped. 2 men at the top, each won the other's permanent check. Rome had looked at the king and decided that the best answer to one man with all the power was 2 men with half of it each, watching each other every day for a year. Beneath the consuls, the structure branched. The praetors administered justice. The censors counted the citizens, assessed their property, and maintained the rolls of the Senate, which meant they held the power to expel men from the Senate entirely, a social and political death few Romans would risk. The aediles ran the city itself, the roads, the markets, the grain supply, the public games. The quaestors managed the treasury. Each office was elected annually, each carried a defined set of powers, and each existed within a web of other offices that could check, delay, or frustrate whatever it tried to do. The whole edifice was deliberately, almost obsessively complicated. The Latin word for this arrangement was the cursus honorum, the course of honors. A Roman who wished to govern Rome had to climb a ladder. You began at the bottom, as a quaestor, probably in your late 20s, handling finances and learning the machinery of administration. Then aedile, managing the city. Then praetor. Then, if fortune and ability and birth and networking all aligned, you reached the consulship, at a minimum age of 42, after decades in public life. The system did not produce young rulers. It produced men who had spent their entire adult lives inside the machine before they were trusted to operate its highest levers. The purpose of this ladder was not merely career management. It was a filter. A man who reached the consulship had been tested, observed, and judged by Rome's political class at every stage of his career. He had served under seniors who watched him. He had held junior offices where his mistakes could be contained. He had built alliances and accumulated obligations across decades of public service, all of which meant that by the time he held real power, he was known, his character assessed, his loyalties mapped, his weaknesses understood. Rome was deeply suspicious of the untested man with ideas, and the cursus honorum was the institutional expression of that suspicion. Above and around all of this sat the Senate. It did not pass laws. It did not elect magistrates. Formally, it was an advisory body, 300 men of senatorial rank who gathered in the curia and issued opinions. Those opinions were called senatus consulta, literally the Senate's advice. And yet every magistrate followed them, almost without exception, because the Senate's authority rested on something no formal power could replicate: the accumulated prestige of the men inside it. These were the families who had governed Rome for generations. Their word carried the weight of everything Rome had ever been. The Senate controlled foreign policy. It managed the treasury. It assigned provinces to magistrates, which meant it determined who commanded armies and where. A magistrate who defied the Senate might be technically within his rights. He would also be politically destroyed, shunned by the families whose cooperation he needed, denied the commands and resources that made a Roman career possible. The Senate's power was not written into the Constitution. It was written into the culture, into the social fabric of a city where birth and reputation and the good opinion of a few hundred families meant everything. Running through the whole system like a structural cable was the concept that the Romans called collegiality. Almost every office was held by more than one man. Almost every magistrate had a colleague of equal rank who could check him. Consuls checked each other. Praetors checked each other. Even the censors, who held no military command and served the longest terms in the Republic, came in pairs. The Romans had observed what happened when a single man held uncontested authority, and they had designed a government that made uncontested authority structurally difficult to achieve. Every time power concentrated, the Constitution had a mechanism waiting to disperse it. There was also the office of the tribune of the plebs, 10 of them, elected each year from the plebeian class, whose entire reason for existing was to protect ordinary Romans from the power of the patrician elite. The tribunes could not command armies. They held no executive authority. But they possessed something more useful in daily politics than any of that: the right of intercessio, the right of intervention. Any tribune could walk into any proceeding, a Senate debate, a magistrate's court, a public assembly, and say, veto, and the proceeding stopped. They were also legally untouchable. To lay a hand on a tribune of the plebs was a capital offense. Rome had built a class of men whose specific function was to be obstacles, and had made them sacrosanct by law. To understand the Republic is to understand that it was not designed for efficiency. It was designed for safety. Every feature that a modern administrator would identify as a flaw, the annual term limits that prevented continuity, the veto powers that allowed one man to paralyze another, the elaborate ladder of offices that slowed the rise of talent, was there specifically to prevent what Rome feared most: the concentration of power in a single hand. The Republic was willing to be slow, willing to be frustrating, willing to sacrifice effectiveness in exchange for the guarantee that no one man could ever become what Tarquin had been. And yet the Republic was also capable of extraordinary speed and decisiveness when the situation demanded it. Buried within the Constitution was a provision that the Romans reached for in genuine emergencies: the dictatorship. When the threat was acute enough, the Senate could authorize the appointment of a single dictator with absolute authority over the entire Roman state. He commanded everything. No veto could touch him. No colleague could check him. He held the power of a king, and he held it for a maximum of 6 months, after which the dictatorship expired and the Republic resumed as if nothing had happened. The provision was used many times in the early and middle republic, and it worked, because the men appointed to it understood exactly what was expected of them. They took the power, solved the crisis, and gave it back. The most famous example was a farmer named Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus. In 458 BC, a Roman army was surrounded and facing annihilation. The Senate sent messengers to Cincinnatus's farm across the Tiber, where they found him plowing his fields. He was appointed dictator, crossed to Rome, raised an army, relieved the trapped soldiers, and resigned the dictatorship, all within 15 days. Then he went home and finished plowing his field. The Romans told this story for centuries because it captured something essential about what the Republic was supposed to be. Power held as a burden, discharged as a duty, and returned the moment it was no longer needed. The Republic was not a perfect system, and no Roman would have claimed it was. The patricians, the old aristocratic families who had monopolized power in the early centuries, had fought the plebeians for 200 years over access to the consulship, the priesthoods, and the courts. The plebeians had won, mostly, by the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. But winning legal equality did not end the dominance of wealth and birth. The men who reached the consulship were almost always from the same small circle of noble families, the same names appearing generation after generation in the consular lists. The Republic was an oligarchy that permitted occasional democratic interventions, and everyone involved knew it. But it worked. For 5 centuries, through wars and plagues and famines and the worst military disaster the ancient Mediterranean world had ever seen, it worked. It produced armies that conquered everything from Iberia to Asia Minor. It produced law codes that shaped the legal thinking of Western civilization for 2,000 years. It produced senators who debated in the morning and commanded legions in the afternoon, and who returned to debate again when the campaigning season ended. It produced a culture of public service so deeply embedded that Romans spoke of dying for the Republic the way they spoke of breathing. The system was not perfect. It was not even especially fair. But it was theirs, and they believed in it. And for a very long time, believing in it was enough. The Republic's army was not a professional force. It was the Roman people, armed. Every spring, after the consuls were elected and the campaign season approached, the citizens of Rome gathered on the field of Mars, and the levy began. Men were summoned, inspected, assigned to legions, and sent to war. They were not soldiers by trade. They were farmers, craftsmen, and smallholders who set down their tools in April, picked up their weapons, and expected to return to their fields before the harvest. That was the model. That was how it had always worked, and for a long time it worked well enough. But the model rested on a specific foundation. To serve in the legions, a Roman man had to own property. Not a great deal of it. The threshold was not high. But enough to outfit himself with basic weapons and armor. Enough to demonstrate that he had something material to defend. The Romans had a word for these men, the adsidui, the reliable ones, the stakeholders, the citizens with skin in the game. Below them, owning nothing or next to nothing, were the capite censi, the head count, citizens counted by head alone because there was no property to assess. They paid no tax, owed no military service, and for most of the Republic's history carried almost no political weight. The legion was not their institution. The Republic was not quite their state. The logic behind this arrangement was not cruelty. It was the same logic that ran through everything the Romans built. A man who owned land had a reason to fight for Rome, because Rome was where his land was. A man with no land had nothing to protect and nothing to lose. The adsidui were the Republic's natural soldiers because the Republic's survival was their personal interest. The army and the state drew from the same pool, the small-holding peasant farmer, working his few acres of Italian soil, doing his military service when called, and returning home when the fighting was done. The citizen soldier was not just a military category. He was the foundational figure of everything the Republic claimed to be. For roughly 2 centuries, this system fed Rome's wars adequately. The campaigns were seasonal and relatively local. Italic tribes, neighboring city-states, the slow, grinding wars of consolidation across the peninsula. A farmer soldier could manage them. He left in spring, fought in summer, came home in autumn. The land survived his absence, tended by his family, or his slaves if he had any, and resumed its business when he returned. The rhythm was sustainable. Then Rome fought Carthage, and the rhythm broke. The First Punic War lasted 23 years, from 264 to 241 BC. The Second Punic War, which brought Hannibal over the Alps and into Italy itself, lasted 17 more, from 218 to 201 BC. These were not seasonal campaigns. They were decades-long mobilizations that kept men under arms for years at a stretch, far from their farms, across seas and mountains and unfamiliar terrain. A smallholder whose holding was 4 or 5 acres could not leave it untended for 3 years and come back to find it intact. The weeds came, the drainage failed, the oxen died or were requisitioned. And when the soldier finally came home, if he came home, the farm he returned to was often worth less than the debt he had accumulated trying to keep it alive from a distance. Some soldiers came home from the Punic Wars to find their farms ruined beyond recovery. They sold what they could and took the money to Rome. Others held on longer, struggling against debt and poor harvests until the pressure became unbearable and the offer from the wealthy neighbor, always patient, always watching, became impossible to refuse. Plot by small plot, the Italian countryside was reorganized. The land did not disappear. It consolidated. It flowed upward, from the hands of the many into the hands of the few, and the few knew exactly what to do with it. While the smallholders were away fighting, a different class of Roman had been getting richer. Rome's conquests brought back not only territory but slaves, hundreds of thousands of them, captured in war, sold in the markets, and put to work on Italian land. A wealthy Roman senator who had access to capital and slave labor could farm on a scale no independent smallholder could match. He could plant olive groves and vineyards that took years to mature, absorbing the weight because he had other income. He could produce grain at a cost below what a family farm could manage. He could buy out his struggling neighbors at distressed prices, fold their fields into his own, and watch the estate grow. The large agricultural estate, the latifundium, spread across the Italian countryside through the 2nd century BC, and where it spread, the smallholder disappeared. There was a legal dimension to this that made it worse. Rome held vast tracts of public land, the ager publicus, confiscated from defeated Italian peoples across the centuries of conquest. This land was technically the property of the Roman state, available for lease to Roman citizens. In practice, wealthy families had occupied it for generations, paying nominal fees and treating it as their own. A law dating back to the 4th century had theoretically capped the amount of public land any individual could hold. Nobody enforced it. The great families grazed their herds across public land they did not own, excluded the smallholders who might legitimately have used it, and accumulated the kind of agricultural dominance that no amount of hard work by a farmer with 5 acres could challenge. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, the consequence was becoming visible in the census returns. The number of men eligible for military service was declining. Not dramatically, not in a single year, but persistently, decade after decade, as the smallholder class that supplied the legions slowly contracted. The men who had qualified as adsidui were vanishing from the Italian countryside and reappearing in Rome, landless, propertyless, technically citizens but no longer the kind of citizens the Republic's army could use. They were the capite censi now, counted but not counted on. You are a farmer in Campania in 150 BC. Your grandfather served at Zama. Your father served in Macedonia. You served in Spain 3 years, and you came back to find the boundary stones moved. and the eastern fields sold to cover a debt your wife had no choice but to take on while you were gone. The neighbor who bought it runs 50 slaves. He does not need your labor and does not want your competition. The farm your family has worked for 4 generations has become part of something larger, something that has no use for you. You pack what you have and you walk north to Rome, where there are perhaps 100,000 others like you, filling the streets, lining up for the grain dole, voting in assemblies that are theoretically yours, but are organized in a way that ensures your single century carries almost no weight. Rome did not experience this as a crisis at first. The city was prosperous. The wars were going well. The Senate debated great questions of foreign policy and the allocation of provinces. The wealthy built townhouses on the Palatine and country villas in the hills outside the city. The grain arrived from Sicily and Sardinia, supplemented now by North Africa. Rome had never been richer, and the men who ran it had never been more comfortable. The countryside was changing, the smallholders were leaving, but the discomfort of that was felt most acutely by the people with the least political power to do anything about it. The military consequence was the one that would eventually become impossible to ignore. A legion needed men who owned property. The Republic kept lowering the property threshold to maintain the numbers, first modestly, then more aggressively. But every reduction was an admission that the pool was shrinking. The citizen soldier who had been the Republic's structural foundation was becoming harder to find. The army that had beaten Hannibal, that had conquered Macedonia and crushed Carthage and extended Roman power to the edges of the known world, was built on a class that was quietly disappearing from the Italian countryside, absorbed into the great estates, replaced by slave labor, and deposited in the streets of Rome with nothing to do and nothing to defend. A senator named Tiberius Gracchus looked at all of this in 133 BC and understood precisely what it meant. He had served in Spain, watched Roman armies struggle with recruitment, and seen the same ruined smallholdings and the same dispossessed families that you have seen in this section. He became tribune of the plebs and proposed to do what the law had technically always required: enforce the land limits, redistribute the illegally occupied public land, and settle the landless poor back on Italian farms where they could once again qualify as adsidui, once again serve in the legions, once again be the kind of citizen the Republic needed them to be. The proposal was not radical. It was, in its own way, deeply conservative, an attempt to restore the social conditions the Republic had always depended on. The Senate killed him for it. Not metaphorically. A group of senators and their clients violently struck down Tiberius Gracchus in a brutal, unarmed mob attack in the street outside the Temple of Fidelity, and threw his body into the Tiber. It was the first political murder in Rome in 400 years. The Republic that had operated on debate and the veto and the rule of collective restraint had just solved a political problem with a mob. The rules that had governed everything were still technically in place, but something had been demonstrated that could not be undemonstrated: that the men at the top were willing to break those rules when the stakes felt high enough. That knowledge did not leave Roman politics. It settled into it. His brother Gaius tried 10 years later, with a broader program of reform that included grain subsidies, road building, and new colonies to absorb the landless poor. He was more effective than Tiberius, and therefore more threatening. The Senate engineered his destruction through a combination of political maneuvering and, eventually, violence. Gaius perished in 121 BC, almost certainly choosing to meet his end on his own terms, surrounded by enemies. 3,000 of his supporters were killed in the aftermath. The land problem remained entirely unsolved. The smallholder class continued to shrink, the legions continued to scrape for recruits, and Rome continued on its way, richer and more powerful than ever on the surface, while the structural rot that would eventually bring everything down continued its quiet, patient work beneath. He was born around 157 BC in a village called Cerate near Arpinum, a small town in the hills southeast of Rome, into a family of the equestrian class, not poor, but far below the senatorial nobility that controlled the highest offices. His family had land and local standing, but in Rome they were nobody. The names that filled the consular lists year after year, the Metelli, the Scipiones, the Aemilii, were families whose ancestors had held the same offices for generations. Gaius Marius had no such ancestors. He had only himself, which in the Rome of his day was almost nothing. He decided it would have to be enough. He served his military apprenticeship under Scipio Aemilianus at the siege of Numantia in 134 BC and came away with a reputation as a soldier's soldier, tough, direct, contemptuous of aristocratic softness, and gifted with the kind of practical intelligence that wins fights. He climbed the cursus honorum slowly and against considerable resistance. The nobility regarded him as an upstart, and they were not subtle about it. He became tribune of the plebs in 119 BC, praetor in 115 BC, and governor of further Spain, where he campaigned against bandits with the same methodical efficiency he would later apply to everything. Rome's great families watched him ascend and found reasons at each stage to hold him in contempt. He noted their contempt, filed it away, and kept climbing. In 107 BC, the Roman campaign in North Africa against a Numidian king named Jugurtha was going badly. Jugurtha was not a great general. He was a clever one, patient, elusive, willing to bribe Roman officers, impossible to pin down in open battle. The aristocratic commanders sent against him had spent years achieving nothing, and the Roman people had run out of patience. Marius campaigned for the consulship of 107 BC on a platform of explicit contempt for the Senate's military failures, and won it, the first plebeian to reach the consulship in more than a century. The Senate was furious. It gave him the right to conscript troops in the traditional way, and expected him to do exactly that. He did not do exactly that. When Marius arrived at the levy and assessed his options, the pool of property-owning citizens available for service was thin. The problem the Gracchi had died trying to solve was still there, still getting worse. Fewer smallholders, fewer men who met the threshold, fewer legions that could be filled by the traditional method. Marius looked at the crowd before him and made a decision that every Roman historian who came after him would mark as one of the great hinges of their history. He opened the levy to the capitae censi, the men with nothing, the landless poor of Rome and the Italian countryside. He took them all. The Senate had not authorized this. The Senate was appalled by it. But Marius had the support of the people's assemblies and the tribunes, which made him very difficult to stop. And in any case, the decision was already made, and the army was already forming. The men who came forward were not reluctant draftees pulled from their farms with half a mind already on the harvest. They were men with no farms, no harvests, no property, and no future in civilian life that amounted to anything. Military service was not an interruption to their lives. It was an opportunity. Regular pay, food, equipment provided by the state, and the prospect, dangled by their general, of land grants when their service was done. They came in thousands. The army Marius built for the Numidian campaign was different in character from anything that had preceded it. He standardized equipment. Every man received the same weapons, the same armor, the same tools. He standardized training. The grueling daily schedule of weapons drill, fortification construction, and route marching in full kit that produced soldiers capable of extraordinary sustained effort. He reorganized the internal structure of the legion, replacing the old manipular formation with cohorts of roughly 480 men each, more flexible and easier to command across varied terrain. He made his men carry their own supplies on the march, reducing the enormous baggage trains that had slowed Roman armies for generations, and earning his soldiers a nickname they wore with something approaching pride: Marius's mules. The eagle, the Aquila, became the standard of the Roman legion under Marius. Legions had carried multiple standards representing different unit formations. Now there was one. It was a small change with an enormous psychological effect. The eagle was not merely a symbol. It was a focus, a point of collective identity so powerful that losing it in battle was considered a catastrophe worse than the loss of life. A legion without its eagle was a disgraced legion. Men who served under the eagle knew what they were part of and what they owed it. Marius took this army to Numidia and finished the war that the aristocratic generals had fumbled for years. Jugurtha was run to ground through a combination of relentless campaigning and a diplomatic coup. It was Marius's young subordinate, a patrician named Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who negotiated the betrayal that delivered Jugurtha into Roman hands. The two men would meet again, in circumstances neither of them could have anticipated, with consequences neither of them would have chosen. But in 105 BC, the war was over. Marius had his triumph, and Rome had a new problem arriving from the north that made Jugurtha seem like a footnote. The Cimbri and Teutones were Germanic peoples moving south in numbers that terrified Rome. In 105 BC, at the Battle of Arausio on the Rhone, two Roman armies fighting under commanders who refused to cooperate with each other were destroyed in sequence. The losses were catastrophic. Perhaps 80,000 Roman soldiers killed, the worst military disaster since Cannae. The tribes had not yet turned toward Italy, but the possibility hung over every Roman's imagination like a shadow. The Senate turned to Marius because there was no one else, and Marius was elected consul for a second time, then a third, a fourth, a fifth. He held the consulship continuously from 104 to 100 BC, something with no precedent in the entire history of the Republic. The rules had not changed. Rome just stopped enforcing them. He used those years well. He drilled his new legions through winter months when Roman armies had traditionally gone into quarters, forced them to march and build fortifications and practice formations until the movements became muscle memory. When the Teutones came south in 102 BC, his army met them at Aquae Sextia in southern Gaul and destroyed them. When the Cimbri crossed the Alps into northern Italy the following year, his army met them at Vercellae and destroyed them too. The slaughter at Vercellae was decisive enough that the Cimbric threat to Italy ceased to exist as a practical military problem within a single afternoon. Rome called Marius the third founder of the city, after Romulus and Camillus. He accepted the honor without apparent modesty. But the Senate had refused to do the one thing that would have made all of it sustainable. When Marius's soldiers from the Numidian campaign completed their service and came to collect the land grants their general had promised them, the Senate blocked it. No new land had been conquered, the senators argued. In North Africa, Rome had merely defended existing territory, and therefore there was no conquered land to distribute. The veterans got nothing. Marius had to use a combination of political pressure and barely disguised intimidation to eventually secure them something, and even then the process was ugly and left scars. When his veterans from the Germanic campaign sought the same settlement, the Senate refused again. Marius could not make it happen a second time. The Senate's refusal was not stupidity. It was the defense of a specific interest. Land redistribution meant land that currently belonged to wealthy Romans, or land adjacent to the public estates that wealthy Romans had been quietly enclosing for generations. The senators who blocked the veteran settlements were the same senators whose families owned the latifundia. They understood perfectly well what was at stake, and they chose their estates over their soldiers. What they did not understand, or chose not to understand, was what that refusal meant for the men it affected. A soldier who had served 16 or 17 years, who had no farm to return to, who had been promised land and denied it, who owed everything to the general who had recruited him and nothing to the Senate that had failed him. That soldier's loyalty was not difficult to predict. The loyalty of the legions shifted. It happened gradually, then all at once, like most of the Republic's catastrophes. The soldiers who enlisted under Marius did not think of themselves as Rome's army in the abstract sense. They thought of themselves as Marius's men. He had taken them when the state wouldn't. He had equipped them, trained them, led them to victories that were the only significant events in their otherwise propertyless lives. He had tried, however imperfectly, to get them their land. The state had done none of those things. The oath that legionaries swore bound them to their commander's service. In the older republic, that had been a legal formality within a broader framework of civic obligation. Now, for the capite censi who had no civic stake in the first place, it was the whole of their loyalty. This was the mechanism. Not ambition, not moral decline, not the corruption of individuals, though all of those were present in abundance. The mechanism was structural and almost inevitable once the pieces were in place. A state that could not retire its own soldiers, combined with a class of soldiers who had nothing beyond their military service, produced armies that owed everything to their generals and nothing to the Senate. Any general willing to make the right promises, land, money, the spoils of a good campaign, had, at his disposal, a tool the Republic had never been designed to handle: a private army with Roman discipline, Roman weapons, and Roman tactical excellence, pointed wherever its patron chose to aim it. Marius had not intended to create this. He had solved a recruitment problem. The Republic would spend the next 100 years paying for the solution. Marius himself demonstrated the consequences with brutal clarity before he died. In 88 BC, his old subordinate Sulla was given command of the war against Mithridates of Pontus in the east, a prestigious command, the kind of appointment that made careers and fortunes. Marius wanted it. He used a sympathetic tribune to transfer the command to himself through a vote of the People's Assembly. Sulla responded by doing something no Roman general had ever done before. He marched his army on Rome. 6 legions, loyal to him personally, crossed the sacred boundary of the city, the Pomerium, the line inside which no general was permitted to lead troops, and seized the capital by force. Marius fled into exile in North Africa, a fugitive in the country where his greatest victories had been won. He came back, eventually, with his own army and his own purge of his enemies, died as consul for the 7th time in 86 BC, and left behind a Rome in which the lesson had been learned by everyone paying attention. The army that was loyal to its general was a political weapon, and the man who held it held everything. The Republic did not die suddenly. It bled out slowly over roughly a century, through a series of crises that each left it a little weaker than before. Each one a demonstration that the old rules no longer held, each one teaching the next generation of ambitious men exactly how far they could push before anything stopped them. The Gracchi were the first wound. Sulla was the infection that followed. What came after Sulla was something worse. A political class that had watched the infection spread and concluded, with cold logic, that the only protection was to acquire an army of their own. By the time Julius Caesar was born, in 100 BC, the Republic was already a machine running on habit and prestige rather than genuine structural health. Sulla had done something that the Republic could not undo simply by passing legislation. He had marched on Rome, seized it by force, and, crucially, survived. He had imposed a dictatorship without a time limit, killed his enemies by the hundreds, restructured the constitution to his liking, and then, in a move that astonished everyone, resigned and retired to his country estate in Campania to write his memoirs. He died in 78 BC of natural causes, which meant that the lesson Rome absorbed was not that such a thing was impossible or that it ended in destruction. The lesson was that it could be done. Pompey himself reportedly said it within years of Sulla's death. If Sulla could, why couldn't he? The social war of 91 to 87 BC, which erupted when Rome's Italian allies rose in armed revolt demanding the citizenship they had been promised and repeatedly denied, forced the Republic to make a concession it had refused for generations. Rome extended full citizenship to the Italian peoples, essentially to the entire population of the peninsula. It was a victory for justice and a catastrophe for the existing political structures. Nearly 1 million new citizens flooded the voting rolls, men with no particular attachment to the old senatorial families, no loyalty to the existing factional networks, and no reason to defer to institutions that had excluded them for centuries. The political landscape of Rome was changed permanently, and the Senate, which had resisted the change, emerged from it diminished. Sulla's constitutional settlement of 81 BC had tried to put everything back together. He expanded the Senate from 300 members to 600, restored its authority over legislation, stripped the tribunes of their ability to propose laws without senatorial approval, and codified the cursus honorum into law rather than custom. He was trying to rebuild the walls he had himself knocked down. His own supporters dismantled most of it within 15 years. In 70 BC, Pompey and Crassus, elected to the consulship together, restored the tribune's powers as casually as if Sulla had never existed. The reforms that a man had killed thousands of Romans to impose lasted barely a decade after his death. Pompey was the dominant figure of the generation between Sulla and Caesar, and his career was a prolonged demonstration of everything the Republic could no longer manage. He had made his name at 19 years old, raising a private army from his family's estates in Picenum and delivering it to Sulla during the Civil War. He had no legal authority to raise troops, and no office that entitled him to command them. It did not matter. He won, and winning was what Rome responded to. Sulla called him Magnus, the Great, and the name stuck. Pompey was 24 years old and had never held a single elected office in the Roman state. The Senate spent the next 3 decades giving Pompey extraordinary commands that the Republic's constitution had never been designed to accommodate. In 67 BC, a tribune named Gabinius proposed giving Pompey supreme command over the entire Mediterranean and all territory within 50 miles of its shores for 3 years to deal with the pirate problem that had grown so severe that grain ships could no longer reach Italy safely. The Senate was furious. This was a command broader than anything a Roman had ever held, a concentration of military authority so vast that it made any general who held it, in practical terms, more powerful than the state. They voted against it. The popular assembly voted for it regardless, and Pompey got his command. He destroyed the pirates in 3 months. The following year, another tribune extended his authority further still, giving him command of the eastern wars against Mithridates of Pontus, with the power to make treaties, settle kingdoms, and reorganize Rome's eastern provinces as he saw fit. Pompey spent the next 5 years doing exactly that, defeating Mithridates, annexing Syria, marching into Jerusalem, reorganizing the entire eastern Mediterranean into a Roman order of his own design. He doubled the revenue flowing into the Roman treasury. He was the most powerful Roman alive, commanding legions that had served under him for years and owed their pay, their prospects, and their identities to him personally. He came back to Italy in 62 BC and did something that surprised everyone who had been watching Sulla's precedent with anxiety. He disbanded his army at Brundisium before entering Italy. He had made the right choice, the Republican choice, the choice that Cincinnatus would have approved. And then the Senate, relieved that he had not marched on Rome, repaid his restraint by blocking everything he needed. His veterans' land settlements were refused. His eastern settlements were rejected wholesale by senators who resented his power and mistrusted his intentions. Pompey had done the right thing and been punished for it. The lesson other men drew from his experience was not subtle. While Pompey was away in the east, Rome had nearly torn itself apart over the Catilinarian conspiracy of 63 BC. A failed consul candidate named Lucius Sergius Catilina, desperate and indebted, assembled a coalition of disaffected veterans, ruined aristocrats, and landless poor, and planned to seize the state by force. The consul Cicero exposed the plot, executed 5 conspirators without trial in what he was certain was a legal emergency, and spent the rest of his life defending that decision. The conspiracy failed, but it demonstrated with unsettling clarity how many Romans had nothing left to lose, how deep the pool of the desperate and dispossessed had become after a century of economic dislocation and political failure. The city that Pompey returned to in 62 BC was one in which violence had become ordinary. The streets of Rome were organized by gangs, armed bands of clients and freedmen attached to competing political figures who fought for control of the forum, intimidated voters at elections, and physically prevented legislation they opposed from being passed. The gang of Publius Clodius Pulcher, a patrician turned tribune of the plebs who had made himself the champion of the urban poor, fought running battles with the gang of Titus Annius Milo for years. The Senate House was burned to the ground in 52 BC when Clodius was killed on the Appian Way. His body was laid out in the Senate chamber, and the crowd that gathered to mourn him set fire to the building. The Senate of Rome was cremated along with the man whose body lay inside it. He was born on the 12th of July, 100 BC, in the Suburra, the dense, noisy, perpetually crowded district that ran through the valley between the Esquiline and Viminal hills in the heart of Rome. It was not a fashionable address. The Suburra was where the city's poor lived, where the streets were too narrow for sunlight to reach the ground for most of the day, where the insulae, the apartment blocks, rose 6 and 7 stories and periodically collapsed onto the people living in them. His family, the gens Julia, was patrician and ancient, claiming descent from Aeneas and through him from the goddess Venus herself. They had the bloodline. They did not have the money, the political influence, or the network of alliances that made patrician blood mean something in the Rome of 100 BC. His father died when Caesar was 16, leaving him the nominal head of a family with grand ancestry and modest means. His uncle by marriage was Gaius Marius, the man who had reinvented the Roman army and held the consulship 7 times, which gave the young Caesar a connection to the populist tradition that would define his politics for the rest of his life. When Sulla marched on Rome and began his proscriptions, Caesar was on the list. He was 17 years old. Sulla's men came looking for him, and he evaded them, slipping through the city at night with the help of friends, until influential intermediaries eventually negotiated his removal from the death list. Sulla relented, but reportedly told those who pleaded for the boy that he saw many a Marius in him. The old dictator was a better judge of character than he knew. Caesar survived Sulla's Rome by leaving it. He served in Asia Minor, earned the civic crown, Rome's second highest military decoration, for saving a fellow soldier's life at the siege of Mytilene, and returned to Rome after Sulla's death to begin the career that would define the century. He threw himself into the law courts with a ferocity that astonished observers, prosecuting corrupt governors and building his reputation as an orator at a time when oratory was the primary instrument of Roman public life. He was not merely competent in the courts, he was brilliant. Cicero, who was the finest orator of the age and did not distribute compliments easily, rated Caesar among the 2 or 3 best speakers Rome had ever produced. The political intelligence that made Caesar extraordinary was not strategic cunning in the narrow sense. It was something deeper, an understanding of what Rome actually ran on, as distinct from what it claimed to run on. Rome claimed to run on law, precedent, and senatorial authority. It actually ran on prestige, obligation, and the management of expectations among a few hundred families whose cooperation or hostility determined whether anything got done. Caesar understood this with a precision that most of his contemporaries, who had grown up inside the system, could not quite achieve because they were too close to it. He saw the machine from the outside, from the Suburra, from the modest family with the ancient name, and what he saw was a set of levers waiting to be pulled. He pulled the first lever with money he did not yet have. He borrowed enormous sums, from Crassus, from bankers, from anyone willing to extend credit against the expectation of future power, and spent it on the Roman people with an openness that the senatorial elite found vulgar and the Roman crowd found irresistible. He funded games, paid for public buildings, hosted banquets, and distributed gifts on a scale that turned his family's ancient but politically inert name into something the ordinary people of Rome knew and felt warmly about. By the time he ran for election as Pontifex Maximus in 63 BC, the chief priest of the Roman state, a position of enormous prestige, he was so deeply in debt that he told his mother, as he left for the election, that he would come home Pontifex Maximus or not at all. He won by a substantial margin. He climbed the cursus honorum with a combination of genuine ability and shameless political calculation. As praetor in 62 BC, he managed the courts. As governor of further Spain in 61 to 60 BC, he ran a rapid military campaign against local tribes, solved his most pressing debts with the proceeds, earned his soldiers' loyalty with their share of the plunder, and returned to Rome entitled to a triumph, a formal military parade through the city that was one of the Republic's most potent ceremonial honors. The Senate, following the advice of Cato, blocked the legal exemption that would have allowed him to remain outside the city limits while awaiting his triumph, and simultaneously declare his candidacy for the consulship. Caesar surrendered the triumph without hesitation and declared his candidacy. The Senate had offered him a choice between ceremony and power. He took power. The consulship of 59 BC demonstrated what Caesar did when he held an office that was supposed to be constrained by collegial checks. His co-consul, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, was a rigid optimate who opposed almost everything Caesar attempted. Caesar responded by sidelining him almost entirely, not by force, but through the popular assemblies, through the support of Pompey's veterans demanding their land settlements and Crassus's financial interests demanding theirs, and through a systematic use of tribunician support that made Bibulus's vetoes practically irrelevant. Bibulus eventually retreated to his house and spent the rest of the year issuing religious proclamations declaring the public calendar inauspicious for legislative business. Caesar passed his legislation anyway. Wits in Rome called the year's consulship not that of Caesar and Bibulus, but that of Julius and Caesar. He went to Gaul in 58 BC as proconsul with 4 legions and a province that offered, in the right hands, the opportunity to build everything Rome's political system required for a serious bid at supreme power: military glory, loyal soldiers, and above all, money. His formal justification for the campaigns that followed was the movements of the Helvetii tribe and the threat of Germanic incursion across the Rhine. The real justification was political arithmetic. A Roman general who won in Gaul would come home rich, celebrated, and commanding the loyalty of an army that had fought alongside him for years. Caesar had watched Pompey do exactly that in the East, and had noted with precision where Pompey had gone wrong afterward. The 8 years in Gaul were the making of the soldier and the general. Caesar's campaigns ranged from the Rhine to the English Channel, across territory that Romans had never penetrated in force, against enemies who were not inferior fighters, but who could not match Roman siege engineering, Roman logistics, or the Roman capacity to absorb defeat and return with a larger army. He crossed the Rhine on a bridge his engineers built in 10 days, not because he needed to conquer Germany, but because bridging the Rhine was the kind of thing that made Romans in the Forum stop and stare at the dispatches. He crossed to Britain twice, again not for permanent conquest, but for the prestige of standing where no Roman commander had stood before. Every bold stroke was reported back to Rome in dispatches that he wrote himself, in prose so clean and direct that they were studied as literary models for generations. The crisis of the Gallic campaigns came in 52 BC, when a chieftain of the Arverni tribe named Vercingetorix achieved what no Gallic leader before him had managed: a single coalition with a coherent strategy. Vercingetorix understood that he could not beat Roman legions in open battle, and chose instead a scorched earth campaign, burning Gallic towns and food supplies to deny Caesar's army the provisions it needed to operate, drawing the Romans into terrain that neutralized their tactical advantages, and waiting for attrition to do what weapons could not. It nearly worked. Caesar suffered a rare and significant defeat at Gergovia. The alliance held and kept growing. The siege of Alesia in September of 52 BC was the moment that settled it. Vercingetorix withdrew 80,000 warriors into the fortified hilltop settlement of Alesia and sent for a relief army while he held out inside. Caesar's response was one of the most extraordinary feats of military engineering in ancient history. He built a double ring of fortifications around the entire hill, an inner wall to trap Vercingetorix in, and an outer wall extending 11 miles to hold off the relief army when it came. Trenches, towers, booby traps, anti-cavalry obstacles. The relief army that arrived numbered, by ancient accounts, 250,000. Caesar's legions held both walls simultaneously. When the outer wall was nearly breached, Caesar himself rode to the crisis point, wearing his distinctive red cloak so his men could see him coming. The breach was sealed. The relief army dispersed. Vercingetorix rode out of Alesia the following morning and laid his weapons at Caesar's feet. The Vercingetorix who surrendered at Alesia would sit in a Roman prison for 6 years before being paraded through the city in Caesar's triumph of 46 BC, and then executed, as Roman custom required of defeated foreign kings. The Gaul that Vercingetorix had tried to defend became a Roman province, its enormous agricultural wealth flowing into the Roman economy, and a significant portion of it into Caesar's personal finances. He came back from Gaul with legions that had fought 8 campaigning seasons under his command and identified themselves entirely with him. He came back with enough money to build a new forum in Rome at his own expense. He came back famous in a way that made Pompey's eastern laurels look, to the men of the forum, like history. The Senate's response to all of this was fear managed badly. The optimates who clustered around Cato and Pompey understood perfectly what Caesar represented. Not merely an ambitious man, but a man who had used the Republic's own mechanisms to place himself beyond the Republic's control. And they tried every institutional remedy available to them. They attempted to strip his command before the legal term expired, leaving him vulnerable to prosecution the moment he became a private citizen. They blocked every compromise proposal his agents brought forward. They refused to let him stand for the consulship in absentia, which would have given him the legal protection he needed to return safely. Each refusal was technically defensible and strategically catastrophic, because each one narrowed Caesar's options toward the one option the Senate most feared. Caesar was not simply a soldier with political ambitions. He was a man who had spent 40 years reading the system with a clarity that nobody else in Roman public life quite matched, and who understood that the Senate's version of the Constitution was already a fiction maintained by the consent of those powerful enough to enforce it. Sulla had demonstrated that. Pompey had demonstrated it more gently. The Gracchi had demonstrated it in their blood. The question for Caesar in the winter of 50 to 49 BC was not whether the Republic's rules still operated. He had watched them fail too many times to believe that, but whether he was willing to be the man who said so explicitly. On the night of January the 10th, 49 BC, he crossed the Rubicon with the 13th Legion and said so. He was 50 years old. He had been alive for the entirety of the crisis that was now reaching its resolution. He had grown up in Sulla's Rome, climbed through the wreckage of the post-Sullan settlement, watched the first triumvirate hold and fracture, and spent 8 years in Gaul building the instrument he now pointed at the Republic's chest. He was not, in any meaningful sense, a revolutionary. He was a man of the Roman nobility who wanted what Roman nobles had always wanted: command, glory, the consulship, the triumph, the acknowledgement of his peers. He had simply been willing to go further than anyone else to get them, because he had understood, earlier and more clearly than most, that the rules governing how far you could go had already stopped being enforced. The river was shallow and narrow, more a boundary in law than in geography, and Caesar crossed it before dawn on the 10th of January, 49 BC, with the 13th legion at his back. He had, at that moment, committed an act of war against the Roman state. Every man who crossed with him knew it. The penalty for a general who led armed troops across the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of Roman territory, was death. Caesar paused on the northern bank, by some accounts for a long time, weighing what he was about to do. Then he said, in Greek, the phrase that philosophers and gamblers used when a risk had been taken past the point of recall. The die is cast. He gave the order to advance, and the 13th legion crossed the Rubicon into Italy. Pompey had assured the Senate that the moment Caesar moved, he would stamp his foot on the ground, and armies would rise from the soil of Italy to defend the Republic. He did not stamp his foot. He fled south, then across the Adriatic to Greece, taking most of the Senate with him. The flight was not cowardice. Pompey was a capable general, and his plan was to consolidate forces, gather the eastern legions that were loyal to him, and return to fight on ground of his choosing. It was, in military terms, a reasonable strategy. Politically, it was a catastrophe. Rome watched the Senate abandon the city and drew its own conclusions about who held the future. Caesar moved through Italy with a speed that outpaced resistance and a policy of clemency that disarmed it. Towns that opened their gates were left in peace. Soldiers who surrendered were offered the choice of joining his legions or going home. Pompey's garrisons, expecting the proscriptions and executions that Sulla had made standard practice, found instead that Caesar wanted their cooperation more than their punishment. He called it clementia, mercy, forbearance, the deliberate decision to build political capital rather than spend it on revenge. It was not sentiment, it was calculation. He was going to need Rome to function when the war was over, which meant he needed Romans who would work with him rather than a city full of families whose fathers he had killed. He dealt with Spain first. Pompey's legions there, cut off from their commander, surrendered after brief campaigns. Then he returned to Rome, held the consulship briefly, and crossed the Adriatic to pursue Pompey himself. The campaign in Greece opened badly. Caesar attempted to blockade Pompey's much larger army at Dyrrhachium on the Albanian coast, a gamble that nearly killed him. Pompey broke through the siege lines and inflicted a sharp defeat that sent Caesar retreating east into Thessaly. It was one of the few times in his military career that he came genuinely close to destruction. Pompey, under pressure from his senatorial allies who could not understand why he refused to press the advantage and finish the war immediately, finally consented to a pitched battle. The two armies met on the 9th of August, 48 BC, on the plain near Pharsalus in central Greece. Pompey had roughly 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Caesar had perhaps 22,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, his legions under strength after 2 years of hard campaigning. The disproportion was significant. Pompey's plan was to use his overwhelming cavalry superiority to sweep around Caesar's right flank, collapse it, and roll up the entire line. Caesar had anticipated this. He had pulled 6 cohorts from his third line and placed them behind his right flank at an angle, concealed from Pompey's view, with orders to use their javelins as close-quarters weapons aimed high at the enemy cavalry, rather than throwing them. When Pompey's horsemen charged, they ran into an unexpected wall of infantry breaking their charge with targeted upper strikes. They broke. Caesar's cavalry pursued them. The battle lasted a few hours, and it ended the Republic as a military contest. Pompey rode from the field in disguise and made for the coast, then for Egypt, where he hoped to find refuge with the young Ptolemy XIII, whose father he had once supported. He did not know that the advisors around the boy king had already calculated which way the wind was blowing after Pharsalus. As Pompey's small boat reached the Egyptian shore on the 28th of September, 48 BC, and he stepped down to wade through the shallows, men who had been sent to greet him struck him down from behind. He was executed, and his remains were taken as a trophy. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria days later and was presented with it, he turned away and wept, or appeared to weep, depending on which account you read. He had been hunting the man for a year. He had not wanted him dead. A living Pompey he could pardon, which would have cost him almost nothing and earned him enormous political goodwill. A dead Pompey was a martyred Pompey, a symbol the Senate's cause could use indefinitely. Egypt detained him longer than the war required. The dynastic struggle between Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra VII offered Caesar strategic opportunity. Egypt's grain wealth was too important to leave in the hands of a hostile court, and a relationship that kept him in Alexandria through the winter of 48 to 47 BC. Cleopatra was 21 years old, politically acute, multilingual, and fighting for her throne with the resources available to her, of which Caesar was the most useful. He installed her as co-ruler with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, fathered a son she named Caesarion, and eventually left for the remaining campaigns that needed finishing. He fought in Asia Minor, where he defeated Pharnaces of Pontus so quickly that his dispatch to the Senate contained only 3 words: Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. The war was not over. The remnants of the Pompeian cause regrouped in North Africa under Metellus Scipio and the indomitable Cato the Younger, who had made a philosophical vocation of his opposition to Caesar and would not surrender under any circumstances. Caesar crossed to Africa in 46 BC, defeated the Pompeian army decisively at Thapsus, and received the news that Cato had chosen a fatal defiance at Utica rather than accept a pardon from a man whose authority he did not recognize. Caesar reportedly said he was sorry because he would have liked to pardon him. Whether that was true or not, Cato's suicide had given the Republic's cause something Caesar could not take from it: a martyr whose death was a more eloquent statement of Republican principle than anything Cato had managed to say while alive. The final campaign was in Spain in 45 BC, against Pompey's sons Gnaeus and Sextus, who were beaten at Munda in a battle Caesar later said had been the closest he had ever come to losing everything. He returned to Rome in the autumn of 45 BC as the undisputed master of the Roman world, and celebrated 5 triumphs in succession for Gaul, Egypt, Asia Minor, Africa, and Spain. The city turned out in enormous numbers. The spectacle lasted days. Vercingetorix, who had sat in a Roman prison for 6 years since his surrender at Alesia, was paraded through the city in chains, and then executed in the traditional manner, executed in the dungeon below the Capitoline. The triumph was the greatest in Rome's history in terms of sheer accumulated glory, and Caesar accepted it with a satisfaction that he made little effort to conceal. He had won every war. He had beaten every enemy. He had crossed the Rubicon and not been destroyed. The Republic's defenders were dead or reconciled. He was 54 years old and had perhaps 20 years ahead of him. The question was what he would do with them. He moved fast, too fast as it would turn out. He packed the Senate with his supporters, raising its membership from 600 to 900 and eventually to 1,000, filling it with men from the Italian towns and from the provinces, some of them perfectly capable senators, many of them men whose chief qualification was loyalty to Caesar, and whose presence in what had been the most exclusive governing body in the world was a daily insult to every old senatorial family forced to sit beside them. He reformed the calendar, replacing the old lunisolar Republican calendar with the Julian calendar of 365 days, and a leap year every 4, that is, with minor adjustments, still in use today. He extended citizenship to communities in Spain and northern Italy. He planted colonies of veterans across the Mediterranean to relieve population pressure in Rome and reward his soldiers simultaneously. He accepted honors that accumulated around him faster than he managed them. The Senate gave him the title Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life, in early 44 BC, abandoning the 6-month limit that had been the office's entire constitutional justification since Cincinnatus. His image appeared on the coins of the Republic, the first living Roman ever to be so honored. Every previous face on Roman coinage had been a god or a dead ancestor. A golden throne sat waiting for him in the Senate chamber. A month was renamed in his honor, Julius, which we still call July. Priests were appointed to maintain a cult in his name. He sat in the Senate wearing the triumphal toga and the laurel wreath of a victorious general, not as a ceremonial occasion, but as his ordinary daily dress. The men watching all of this were not stupid, and they were not simply jealous, though jealousy was part of it. What they saw, what men like Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus saw, was the Republic being methodically dismantled and replaced with a monarchy that refused to use the word. The Senate had been stuffed with Caesar's clients. The elections had been predetermined. Caesar had announced the results of consular elections years in advance, for 43 and 42 and 41 BC, as if the votes were a formality his calendar needed to accommodate. The magistracies that had been the Republic's operating system for 5 centuries were still being held and titled and ceremonially enacted, but they no longer meant anything, because every decision of consequence was made by one man in the triumphal toga on his golden throne. There were roughly 60 conspirators. They included former Pompeians who had accepted Caesar's pardon, and Caesarians who had served with him in Gaul and felt that what they had fought for was not this. Brutus was Caesar's close friend, possibly more by some ancient accounts, a man of genuine philosophical commitment to republican principles, whose participation gave the conspiracy a moral weight it would otherwise have lacked. Cassius was the operational mind, the man who knew how to organize 20 or more men with daggers into something that did not leak before it happened. They chose the Ides of March, the 15th, 3 days before Caesar was to leave for a campaign in Parthia that would take him out of Rome for years. If it was going to be done, it had to be done before he left. The Senate met on the 15th of March, 44 BC, in the Curia of Pompey, the meeting hall attached to the theater of Pompey, since the Senate house in the Forum was still being rebuilt after Clodius's funeral fire. Caesar arrived late, having been warned that morning by a soothsayer, having been begged by his wife Calpurnia not to attend, having perhaps suspected something without quite believing that Romans of this class would actually do it. He took his golden chair. The conspirators gathered around him on the pretext of presenting a petition regarding one of their associates who had been exiled. When Caesar waved them off, Lucius Tillius Cimber grabbed his toga. The first strike landed from behind. Then the others came, striking him 24 times in all, enough that several of the conspirators accidentally wounded each other in the press of bodies around him. He fell at the base of a statue of Pompey and lay lifeless on the marble floor, while the Senate fled the building in terror, and the assassins walked out into the street, calling on Rome to celebrate its freedom. The celebration did not come. The crowd that gathered was silent and confused, not jubilant. Mark Antony, Caesar's consul and closest lieutenant, had escaped the Curia alive and secured Caesar's papers and treasury before the conspirators could reach them. The assassins had planned how to kill Caesar with meticulous care, and had planned almost nothing about what came next. No program, no successor, no plan for the legions in the field, no answer to the hundreds of thousands of Caesar's veterans who were waiting for their land settlements. They had killed the man who had broken the Republic, and in doing so they had proved, beyond any further argument, that the Republic was beyond recovery. The system they believed they were restoring had not existed in any meaningful sense for at least a generation, and its absence was now absolute. What came next was not the Republic. It was 13 years of war. The men who walked out of the Curia of Pompey on the Ides of March carrying their daggers had imagined a Rome that erupted in gratitude. The Forum would fill with citizens cheering the restoration of the Republic. The Senate would reconvene in dignity. The magistrates would resume their offices. The machine would restart, purged of the man who had jammed it, and Rome would go back to being Rome. What actually happened was that the streets emptied in silence. Shops closed. People went inside and bolted their doors. The crowd that gathered near the theater of Pompey was not jubilant. It was frightened, watching armed men walk through the Forum with blades still wet, waiting to see what came next. Mark Antony moved faster than the conspirators had anticipated. As Caesar's consul and closest lieutenant, he had been deliberately excluded from the killing. Brutus had insisted that this was a surgical removal of a tyrant, not a general purge, and that Antony's death alongside Caesar would look like something other than what they wanted it to look like. That decision handed Antony a survival and a platform simultaneously. Within hours of the assassination, he had secured Caesar's papers and his personal treasury, both delivered by Caesar's widow Calpurnia, who recognized in Antony the most capable of Caesar's allies, and the man most likely to protect what her husband had built. The conspirators had the body. Antony had the money and the documents. The compromise that Antony brokered with the assassins in the days that followed was a masterpiece of tactical generosity that concealed a long-term trap. Caesar would not be declared a tyrant, which meant his legislation remained valid, his appointments stood, and his veterans' land promises were legally enforceable. The conspirators received amnesty. Both sides agreed to a public funeral at which Brutus would speak first. What nobody on the conspirators' side had fully calculated was what Antony intended to do with his turn at the funeral podium, or what Caesar's will would reveal when it was read to the Roman people. Caesar had left 300 sesterces to every citizen of Rome. He had left his gardens across the Tiber to the public as a park, and he had named as his primary heir not Antony, not Cleopatra's son Caesarion, but his 18-year-old great-nephew, Gaius Octavius, who was at a military training camp in Apollonia on the coast of modern Albania when the news reached him. The will also contained a posthumous adoption, making Octavius legally Caesar's son. Henceforth, Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, with all the name's political weight attached to it. Antony, who had expected to inherit Caesar's political legacy, if not his estate, received neither. He had spent the last decade as Caesar's most trusted lieutenant, and the will had passed him over for a teenager he regarded as no serious threat. That miscalculation would cost him everything. Antony's funeral oration did what Brutus's careful philosophical speech had not. He stood before the Roman crowd in the Forum, held up Caesar's torn toga, displayed the fallen dictator for all to see, and read the will aloud. He did not need to say that the men who had done this were murderers. The crowd concluded that independently. Riots erupted across the city. The conspirators barricaded themselves inside their houses. Brutus and Cassius, finding Rome suddenly lethal territory, left for the east within weeks, where they began the process of raising armies from the provinces and client kingdoms they controlled. The Republic's liberators, as they called themselves, were now fugitives raising private armies in the provinces of the state they had claimed to be saving. The circle was complete. Octavian arrived in Rome in the spring of 44 BC, 19 years old, slight in build, prone to illness, with no military reputation and no political base beyond the name he had just inherited. Antony looked at him and saw a boy to be managed. Cicero looked at him and saw a useful instrument, young enough to be guided, prestigious enough to be valuable against Antony, who had become Cicero's chief political enemy. Both men were wrong about him in ways that proved fatal. Octavian accepted the name, began the legal process of confirming his adoption, and started doing something that exposed his instincts with perfect clarity. He began visiting Caesar's veterans in their colonies and asking for their support. He was offering them nothing they did not already feel. He was Caesar's son. That was sufficient. The months that followed were a sequence of betrayals and reversals so rapid that no narrative quite captures the speed of it. Octavian and Antony maneuvered against each other for Caesar's veterans and Caesar's legacy. Cicero delivered his Philippics in the Senate, a series of speeches attacking Antony with a savagery of language that Antony did not forget and did not forgive, and persuaded the Senate to back Octavian's private army against Antony's attempt to seize the province of Cisalpine Gaul. The two consuls and Octavian together defeated Antony at the Battle of Mutina in April 43 BC. Both consuls died in the fighting. Octavian, now the senior military figure on the winning side, marched his army to Rome and demanded the consulship. He was 19 years old. The minimum age was 42. The Senate's soldiers entered the chamber, and the Senate awarded him the consulship without further discussion. By October of 43 BC, Octavian had concluded what anyone watching his movements that year could have predicted. The Senate was using him and intended to discard him the moment Antony was neutralized, exactly as Cicero had planned. He met Antony and the general Lepidus near Bononia, and the three of them divided the Roman world between them. The arrangement was formally ratified by the Senate in November through the Lex Titia, granting the three men supreme authority for 5 years. It was the second triumvirate, and unlike the informal understanding between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this one had the force of law and the backing of armies that had stopped pretending to serve anyone but their commanders. The Republic, which technically still existed as a set of institutions, was now openly administered by three men with absolute power and no constitutional constraint. The proscriptions came immediately. 300 senators and over 2,000 equestrians were condemned, their names posted in the forum, their property confiscated, their lives forfeit to whoever could collect the reward. The fallen were displayed on the rostra, the speaker's platform in the forum from which Rome's greatest orators had addressed the Roman people for centuries. Among them was Cicero's. Antony had insisted on it. Cicero had been given the chance to flee and had hesitated too long, debating whether to accept Octavian's protection or make for Macedonia. He was caught on the road to the coast on the 7th of December, 43 BC, and killed by soldiers. He was struck down, and the hand that had written the Philippics was taken as a grisly trophy and displayed in the forum. He was 63 years old and had spent his entire adult life defending the Republic in prose of a quality Rome had never seen before and never would again. The battle that settled the conspirators' fate came in October 42 BC at Philippi in northern Greece, where Brutus and Cassius had assembled the largest Republican army that would ever take the field. 2 engagements were fought within days of each other. In the first, Cassius, believing the battle lost when it was not, commanded his own freedmen to deliver a final, fatal strike. He died before he knew the result. Brutus held on for several more days before his position became untenable, and he embraced his final defeat on the battlefield. With both men dead, the cause they represented died with them. There was no longer any military force in the field flying the standard of the Republic. The war that had begun on the Ides of March was over, and the Republic had lost it. The triumvirate divided the Roman world at Philippi, and the division immediately created the fault line that the next decade would split open. Antony took the east, the wealthy provinces of Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, and the Greek-speaking world that Rome had been harvesting for a century. Lepidus took North Africa. Octavian received the hardest assignment, Italy and the West, which meant settling the veterans of Philippi on Italian land, which meant dispossessing Italian farmers who had never voted for any of this and who would now find soldiers at their gates telling them their fields belonged to someone else. The town of Cremona was stripped bare. When Cremona did not provide enough land, the neighboring city of Mantua suffered for its proximity. A young poet named Virgil, whose family farm near Mantua was among those confiscated, was among the dispossessed. He would eventually write the Aeneid, the epic poem that gave Augustus's Rome its founding mythology. Antony settled in the East with the ease of a man who had inherited a world. He met Cleopatra at Tarsus in 41 BC, a queen who had already demonstrated with Caesar that she understood precisely how to make herself indispensable to the most powerful Roman alive. The relationship between Antony and Cleopatra was not purely political. By most accounts, it was also genuine, but it had political consequences that Antony, who was more soldier than strategist, did not manage with sufficient care. He spent winters in Alexandria when he should have been managing Italy. He conducted a disastrous campaign against Parthia in 36 BC that cost him tens of thousands of men and achieved nothing, damaging his military reputation at the precise moment Octavian was quietly building his own. He married Cleopatra in the Egyptian manner in 37 BC, despite being legally married to Octavian's sister Octavia. Rome noted everything. Octavian spent the same years doing the less glamorous, more consequential work of building a base. He defeated Sextus Pompey, who had been using Sicily as a base to blockade Rome's grain supply, in a naval campaign in 36 BC. He secured Italy, managed the veteran settlements with as much political skill as the brutality of the dispossessions allowed, and cultivated the image of a Roman traditionalist, pious, disciplined, attentive to the old gods and the old forms, that stood in deliberate contrast to the orientalized court Antony was building in Alexandria. When Antony formally announced the donations of Alexandria in 34 BC, granting Roman territories to Cleopatra and her children, including Caesarion, Caesar's son by Cleopatra, Octavian opened Antony's will, which had been deposited with the Vestal Virgins in Rome. He read it publicly in the Senate. It reportedly stated that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra. The Senate was outraged, whether the will said what Octavian claimed it said or not. The war that followed was declared not against Antony, but against Cleopatra, a legal and rhetorical maneuver of considerable ingenuity, since it reframed what was plainly a Roman civil war as a foreign war of defense against an Eastern queen who had seduced a Roman general into betraying his country. It allowed Octavian to avoid the politically toxic accusation of killing Roman citizens and to present himself instead as the defender of Roman values against Eastern corruption. At the Battle of Actium in September 31 BC, off the western coast of Greece, Octavian's fleet, under the command of his brilliant general Marcus Agrippa, met the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The battle was not especially dramatic by the standards of what had preceded it. Antony's fleet was undermanned and his army depleted by desertion, but it was decisive. Antony and Cleopatra broke through the encirclement and fled south toward Egypt. Their land forces surrendered the following day. Antony chose a fatal end in Alexandria in August of 30 BC, on a false report that Cleopatra was already dead. She was not. She received Octavian when he entered the city, assessed her situation with the cold clarity that had served her through 2 decades of dangerous politics, and concluded that he intended to parade her through Rome in his triumph. She embraced her final defeat through fatal means. By some accounts from an asp, though the detail may be legend, on the 12th of August, 30 BC. Caesarion, Caesar's young heir by Cleopatra, was eliminated by Octavian's forces. One Caesar was sufficient. Egypt became a Roman province, its grain wealth flowing into Octavian's treasury. Its royal dynasty ended in the space of a summer. Octavian returned to Rome in 29 BC as the last man standing in a generation that had consumed itself in war. He was 32 years old. The world was his. The question was, what kind of world he intended to make it. He had watched Caesar die for making the same mistake twice. The first time Caesar made it was at his triumph, when he turned his back on a senator who had not risen to greet him. A small slight, publicly witnessed, talked about for days. The second time was every morning he walked into the Senate in his triumphal toga and sat on his golden throne and let the room feel exactly how far below him it was. Caesar had understood the Republic's structural failure with extraordinary precision and had done almost nothing to manage the optics of replacing it. He had treated Rome's political class with the contempt of a man who had beaten them, and they had killed him for it. Octavian understood this lesson at a level Caesar never had. He was going to take everything Caesar had taken. He was not going to look like he was doing it. The 3 years between his return from Egypt in 29 BC and the great settlement of January 27 BC were years of methodical preparation. He celebrated his 3 triumphs, for Illyria, Actium, and Egypt, with appropriate public splendor, and then put away the symbols of military glory with a deliberateness that Rome was meant to notice. He closed the doors of the Temple of Janus, a ceremonial act declaring that Rome was no longer at war, for only the 3rd time in the city's entire recorded history. He restored 82 temples in a single year. He rebuilt the roads. He repaired the aqueducts. He reduced his own bodyguard, walked the streets of Rome without ostentatious protection, and attended dinner parties given by men who had fought against him, behaving as if the civil wars were history and what remained was the business of governing a city at peace. Rome breathed out for the first time in a generation. On the 13th of January, 27 BC, he stood before the Senate and made his extraordinary speech. He had decided, he told them, to lay down all his powers and return them to the Senate and the Roman people. The extraordinary commands, the control of the provinces, the armies, all of it was being returned. The Republic was restored. His work was done. The theater of it was exquisite. He had timed it perfectly, building weeks of rumor and expectation before the announcement, so that when senators rose to beg him not to abandon Rome to chaos, they were doing so with the genuine alarm of men who had lived through 13 years of civil war and had no desire to live through more. The protests were real, even if the scene had been scripted. He accepted their entreaties with carefully performed reluctance and agreed to remain, but only to manage a temporary assignment, the governance of those provinces that still required military oversight. He would hold this responsibility for 10 years. Then he would give it all back. What he had actually done, in the language of constitutional arrangements, was simultaneously surrender the extraordinary powers of the Civil War period and receive in their place something structurally more durable. The Senate granted him a 10-year proconsular command over the provinces of Spain, Gaul, Syria, and Egypt, which between them contained the overwhelming majority of Rome's active legions. Provinces the Senate governed still existed, still had their senatorial governors, still maintained the forms of republican administration. They simply contained almost no soldiers. The armies were in Augustus's provinces, under his command, loyal to him by 13 years of continuous service and the personal bond that Marius had first forged and Caesar had refined. He held absolute military power while wearing the costume of a temporary steward. 3 days after the speech, the Senate gave him a name. He had been Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus since his adoption, a useful name, wielded precisely, but not his own. What they gave him on the 16th of January, 27 BC, was something unprecedented in Roman history. The word was Augustus, from the Latin augere, to increase, to consecrate, to make venerable. It was not a title in the formal constitutional sense. It was not rex, king, which would have ended him as it had ended Caesar's ambitions and Tarquin's dynasty. It was a quality, a sanctified, almost religious attribute attached to his person that placed him above the ordinary categories of Roman office without technically belonging to any of them. He became Augustus. The name had no legal definition and therefore could not be legally challenged. It simply described what he was. The settlement of 27 BC was the foundation, but it was not the completed building. He spent the following years filling in the structure with a patience that was one of the most remarkable things about him. In 23 BC, when it became clear that his continuous holding of the consulship was causing resentment, every year he occupied one of the two senior offices meant one fewer consular appointment available to the senatorial families who had competing for those positions for centuries. He gave up the consulship. He GDK'd up, and in exchange he received from the Senate two powers that made the office irrelevant by comparison. The first was tribunicia potestas, the power of a tribune of the plebs, held for life. The second was imperium maius, supreme authority over all provinces, including those nominally governed by the Senate, overriding the authority of any other magistrate anywhere in the Roman world. He now held more power than he had held as consul, in a form that was less visible and less politically provocative. The tribunician power was a stroke of institutional genius. The tribune of the plebs had been the Republic's most potent symbol of popular protection, the sacred, untouchable defender of ordinary Romans against the power of the aristocracy. Every Roman knew what a tribune was and what a tribune stood for. By assuming the tribunician power for life, Augustus wrapped himself in that symbolism permanently. He was not a king, not a dictator, not even a consul. He was the protector of the Roman people, the man in whose person the oldest democratic institution of the Republic lived on. He dated his reign not from Actium or from the settlement of 27 BC, but in the annual numbering of his tribunician years, a counting system that placed him in a continuous line stretching back cunes elected by the plebs of Rome 4 centuries earlier. He was the Republic's latest expression of its own most fundamental principle. The audacity of it was breathtaking. He rebuilt the Senate, but carefully. Having pacted with loyalists during the civil wars, he now purged it, reducing it from a bloated, politically compromised body of 1,000 members back toward the sullen figure of 600. Removing men whose presence was an embarrassment, and keeping those whose families gave the institution its historic weight. The senatorial families who remained found that under Augustus they held more dignity than they had held under Caesar, more ceremonial respect, more formal deference from the man who governed them. What they did not hold was power, actual, substantive decision-making power over the questions that mattered. They debated what Augustus permitted them to debate. They governed the provinces he assigned to them. They occupied the consulships and praetorships and aedileships that Rome's ancient constitution prescribed, and in doing so, they provided the Republic's institutions with warm, living bodies that made the whole edifice look exactly like what Augustus claimed it was: the restored Republic, functioning as intended. The image he projected was constructed with the same care he brought to everything else. He lived in a modest house on the Palatine Hill, not a palace, not a monument to accumulated power, but a relatively ordinary Roman dwelling that sent a specific message about what kind of man he was. He wore plain wool togas, woven by his wife and daughters. He ate simple food. He was famously accessible, sitting in the forum to hear petitions from ordinary citizens, walking through the market without a ceremonial escort. He maintained the old religious practices with conspicuous devotion, restoring the priesthoods, reviving ancient festivals, and positioning himself as the guardian of Rome's relationship with its gods. When the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state, died in 12 BC, Augustus took the office. The same office Caesar had held, the same one he himself had coveted as a young man with ambitions and debts. He held it for the rest of his life. The building program that transformed Rome under his reign was both genuine civic improvement and sustained political communication. He found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, a line that ancient writers attributed to him, and that he almost certainly said, because it captured exactly what he wanted posterity to understand about his reign. The Forum of Augustus, with its temple to Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger, built in fulfillment of a vow made before the Battle of Philippi against the murderers of Caesar, was a statement in stone about the legitimacy of his power and its roots in the divine. The Ara Pacis, the altar of peace consecrated in 9 BC, depicted Augustus and his family in procession alongside the priests and senators of Rome, an image of civic harmony in which the first citizen walked as the foremost among equals rather than above them. Every building was a sentence in the same argument. This is restoration, not revolution. His family became the visible symbol of the new order's continuity. His wife Livia, whom he had married in 38 BC, controversially, since she had been pregnant by her first husband at the time, was the model of Roman matronhood. Dignified, discreet, politically attentive, and possessed of a practical intelligence that Augustus valued, and Roman moralists celebrated without quite acknowledging what it meant for the conduct of public affairs. The succession question consumed him for decades, because the one thing the Principate could not do, if it was to remain a restored republic, was name an heir in the manner of a monarchy. He worked around this constraint with the tools available, adopting relatives, awarding tribunician power to chosen successors, arranging marriages that bound the families of potential heirs to his own. But the succession remained the great unresolved structural problem of everything he had built. The moral legislation of 18 BC was Augustus reading the political room with his customary precision. The Julian laws on marriage and adultery, which penalized celibacy and childlessness among the upper classes, rewarded families with 3 or more children, and criminalized adultery as a public offense rather than a private matter, were ostensibly about restoring the old Roman virtues that the civil wars had corroded. They were also about something more immediate. The senatorial and equestrian classes, whose cooperation the Principate required, needed to understand that the social order was being rebuilt as well as the political one. The laws were not popular among the people they targeted. They were enforced selectively. But they existed, and their existence was part of the message Augustus was sending about what Rome was and what it would be under his stewardship. The Praetorian Guard, which Augustus established as a permanent bodyguard force of 9 cohorts stationed in and around Rome, was the military reality behind the performance of modest accessibility. The Guard was not the enormous standing army of later emperors. Augustus kept most of the cohorts outside Rome itself, billeted in neighboring towns, to avoid the appearance of a garrison occupation of the capital. But they were there, available, loyal to him personally, and constituted a force that no civilian conspiracy could match. The Senate that listened to his speeches and passed his legislation did so in a city that was, beneath its Republican theater, politely occupied by men who answered to one person. The veto that had once stopped everything in the old republic had been replaced by the quiet certainty that there was no point in using it. He survived 4 decades in power by adapting the presentation without ever relinquishing the substance. When the consulship caused resentment, he gave it up and kept the power. When the provinces required adjustment, he renegotiated the arrangements. When a successor died, and they kept dying, Marcellus in 23 BC, Agrippa in 12 BC, Gaius Caesar in 4 AD, Lucius Caesar in 2 AD, he absorbed the grief publicly, mourned conspicuously, and found another arrangement. His own health was persistently poor. He came close to death in 23 BC and again at various points across his long reign, and the uncertainty of succession was a constant political vulnerability. He managed it by keeping his intentions opaque until he was ready to declare them, which was another form of control. Nobody could plan against a succession that hadn't been announced. When the Senate voted him the title Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland, in 2 BC, at a ceremony in which a delegation led by the historian Valerius Messala formally presented the honor, Augustus accepted it with tears, according to ancient sources, and said that he had achieved all he had ever wanted. He had been the first citizen of Rome for 25 years. The Senate that had stabbed his father in the back 33 times had just called him the father of the nation. The legions that had once sold their loyalty to whoever paid best were now the professional army of the Roman state. The republic whose institutions he had inherited still met, still elected, still debated. The empire whose institutions he had actually built had been running, quietly and effectively, beneath the republic's face for a generation. Whether he wept from pride or from the specific satisfaction of a man who had played the most complex political game in Western history and had won, the ancient sources do not say. Probably both. He died on the 19th of August, 14 AD, at Nola, south of Rome, in the same town where his father had died 58 years earlier. He was 75 years old. His last words, by the account of the biographer Suetonius, were a question to the friends gathered around his bed. Had he played his part well? And then the actor's traditional request for applause, delivered in Greek, the language of philosophy and performance. He had played the part for 44 years. No director had written the script. He had written it himself, revised it continuously, kept the audience watching, and left the stage on his own terms, which was the one thing Julius Caesar had not managed to do. Everything that had gone wrong with the Roman Republic since the Gracchi, every civil war, every proscription, every general who had marched his army on Rome, traced back in the end to a single unsolved problem. The Roman state had never built a reliable mechanism to pay or retire its own soldiers. The legions had privatized themselves because they had to. A man who served 20 years under arms and came home to nothing had no reason to feel loyalty to an abstraction called the Republic. He had every reason to feel loyalty to the general who had fed him, led him, and promised him something at the end of it. Augustus had watched this dynamic destroy the Republic, had benefited from it personally during the civil wars, and understood with cold precision that it had to be closed permanently if anything he had built was to survive him. The Aerarium Militare was how he closed it. He did not move immediately. The first years after Actium were spent settling the vast backlog of veterans accumulated across 2 decades of civil war. Roughly 300,000 men who needed land, money, or both before they became a political problem rather than a solved one. He paid for most of it himself, drawing on the enormous wealth of Egypt and his own accumulated resources. The land distributions of the post-Actium period were the last time Rome would settle veterans primarily on Italian soil. The Italian countryside had been disrupted enough. The confiscations that had uprooted Virgil's family near Mantua and thousands of others like them had stored up resentments that Augustus had no interest in compounding. After the last of the Civil War veterans were settled, he needed a different system. He built one. Around 13 BC, he began the transition. Land grants to retiring soldiers, which had been the Republic's default reward since the earliest legions, were quietly replaced with cash payments. A legionary who completed his service received 3,000 denarii as his retirement bounty, the premium militare. A Praetorian guardsman received 5,000. The amounts were set precisely enough to be meaningful. 3,000 denarii represented roughly 13 years of base pay for a legionary, and standardized enough to be predictable. A soldier who enlisted in Augustus's army knew from his first day of service exactly what awaited him at the end of it. He did not need to cultivate his general's goodwill. He did not need to follow his commander into civil war to secure his retirement. The state had already made him a promise, in writing, enforceable at law. The shift from land to cash was more consequential than it first appeared. Land grants had tied veterans to specific pieces of Italian or provincial soil, creating communities of former soldiers who were simultaneously landowners, local political actors, and potential military resources for whoever could mobilize them. The late Republic's civil wars had been fought repeatedly by veterans who had been settled, had watched their settlements threatened, and had rallied again to the general who had originally given them the land. Cash payments dissolved that dynamic. A man who received 3,000 denarii and chose where to spend them, in a provincial city, in a colony, in his hometown, was not tied to a patron who had given him his farm. He was simply a man who had been paid. The system needed a permanent funding mechanism, and in 6 AD, Augustus created one. The Aeraria Militare, the military treasury, was established on the Capitoline Hill as a dedicated public institution with a single purpose: to fund the retirement bonuses of every soldier in the Roman army. Augustus capitalized it himself with a personal contribution of 170 million sesterces, an enormous sum that he included in his Res Gestae, the account of his achievements he arranged to be published after his death, apparently regarding it as among the most important things he had ever done. He was right to regard it that way. The personal contribution was the seed. The ongoing revenue was the point. The treasury was funded by two new taxes. The first was a 5% inheritance tax, the vicesima hereditatium, levied on estates passed to anyone outside the immediate family. Inheritances to spouses and children were exempt, but legacies to more distant relatives, friends, and associates were taxed at 5%, with the proceeds flowing directly into the military treasury. The second was a 1% sales tax on goods sold at auction. Both taxes were unpopular. The Roman aristocracy, which had been accustomed to passing wealth between families without interference from the state, found the inheritance tax particularly galling. When Tiberius was later pressed to abolish it, he pointed out flatly that without it, there was no money to pay the veterans. The tax stayed. 3 prefects, the praefecti aerarii militaris, administered the fund, drawn initially from former praetors and selected by lot in a deliberate echo of Republican practice. The randomness of selection intended to signal that no individual patron controlled the dispensation of veteran benefits. The prefects managed disbursements, maintained records, coordinated with legionary commanders across the empire about upcoming discharges, and ensured that the money was where it needed to be when soldiers completed their service. Every year, between 6,000 and 7,000 men reached the end of their 20-year term and became eligible for their retirement bounty. The system processed them steadily, reliably, and without the drama that had attended every previous attempt at veteran settlement in Roman history. The service terms themselves were fixed with a precision the Republic had never achieved. A legionary served 20 years of active duty, followed by 5 years in the veteran reserve, the vexillarii, during which he was exempt from routine fatigues and garrison duties, but remained available for emergency deployment. A Praetorian guardsman served 16 years. The auxiliaries, the non-citizen troops recruited from the provinces who formed an essential part of the imperial army, served 25 years. Children, a grant that in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD was among the most valuable things the Roman state could bestow. The terms were published, known, and held. A recruit in Britain or Syria or Egypt who enlisted under Augustus knew the duration of his commitment, the pay he would receive, and the settlement that waited at the end of it. The state had become, for the first time in Roman history, a reliable employer. The army itself was restructured around this new permanence. Augustus reduced the bloated force of the Civil War period. At its peak, there had been over 60 legions under arms across the various factions, to 28 permanent legions, totaling roughly 150,000 men, supplemented by an approximately equal number of auxiliary troops. Each legion had a permanent station, a permanent numerical designation, and a permanent identity that persisted across generations of recruits. The 6th Legion Ferrata, the ironclad, had served in the East for decades. The 20th Legion, Valeria Victrix, had its home in Britain. These were not temporary forces raised for a campaign and disbanded when it ended. They were institutions, with histories, traditions, and identities that recruited men inherited when they joined and added to when they served. The oath every soldier swore changed in its fundamental orientation. Republican soldiers had sworn to their consuls and to each other. The oath bound them to the campaign, to the unit, and in practice, as Marius had discovered and Sulla had confirmed, to the general who commanded them. Augustus's soldiers swore directly to him, personally, by name. When he died and Tiberius succeeded him, the legions renewed their oaths to Tiberius. The oath was to the emperor, not to a specific man's charisma or promise of reward, which meant that the loyalty it created was transferable in a way that the personal bonds of the Civil War period had never been. A soldier who served under a competent but undistinguished legate in a quiet province on the Rhine was still the emperor's soldier, bound by the same oath as the legions on the Danube or in Syria, paid from the same treasury, awaiting the same retirement. The civil service that administered all of this was built with the same quiet thoroughness. The Republic had governed its provinces through senatorial magistrates who arrived for a year or two, used the position to accumulate wealth and prestige, and left behind whatever administrative continuity their personal staff maintained. Augustus replaced this intermittent attention with a permanent apparatus. Equestrian officials, imperial freedmen, and professional administrators who remained in post across multiple governors, maintained the records, collected the taxes, and ensured that the machinery of provincial government ran whether or not the current governor was competent or engaged. It was unglamorous work, invisible in the historical record compared to the battles and the speeches, and it was probably the most important administrative innovation of the Augustan settlement. Egypt was administered differently from every other province, and the difference was deliberate. No senator was permitted to enter Egypt without the emperor's personal permission. The province was governed by an equestrian prefect appointed directly by Augustus, answerable only to him, controlling the grain supply that fed Rome and the agricultural surplus that funded the treasury. The lesson of Antony, that a senator with Egypt was a senator with an independent power base, had been absorbed completely. Egypt was personal imperial property, managed like an estate, generating revenue that flowed to the emperor directly, rather than through the mechanisms of the state treasury. It was the most honest expression of what the Principate actually was, stripped of its republican performance. One man's private resource, generating the wealth that sustained everything else. You are a legionary of the 5th Legion Macedonica in 10 AD. Stationed at Troesmus on the lower Danube. You enlisted 17 years ago in your home province of Galatia, the son of a man who had been granted citizenship by Caesar during the civil wars. You have served in 3 provinces. You have built roads and bridges and fortified camps, and you have fought twice along the frontier against the tribes across the river. In 3 years, you will complete your 20th year of service, and you know precisely what that means. 3,000 denarii, paid from a treasury in Rome that exists for no other purpose than to pay you. You do not know the name of the equestrian prefect who administers the fund. You do not need to. The promise has been made by the emperor and by the Roman state, and in 17 years you have watched it kept, year after year, for every man who reached the end of his service before you. This was the mechanism that made everything else possible. The Principate did not rest ultimately on the theatrical performance of restored republicanism, nor on the building programs, nor on the moral legislation, nor even on the personal authority of the man who held the title of Augustus. It rested on the fact that the men with the weapons, the 150,000 legionaries and their auxiliary counterparts stationed along the frontiers of the Roman world, were paid reliably, retired securely, and owed their loyalty to an institution rather than to a man. Suetonius, writing a century after Augustus, said that the aerarium militare was created specifically because retired soldiers with nothing to live on were inclined to support coups and foment unrest. He was right, and he understood exactly what Augustus had understood, that the civil wars of the late Republic had been, at their structural root, a pension problem. The treasury solved the pension problem. The civil wars stopped. When Augustus listed the aerarium militare in his res gestae alongside his military victories and his building programs and the restoration of 82 temples, he was not being modest about his martial achievements or falsely humble about the legal architecture of the Principate. He was telling whoever read it, and he intended everyone to read it, what he believed had actually mattered. Not the battles, not the titles, the treasury. the permanent, tax-funded, institutionally administered mechanism through which the Roman state finally took responsibility for the men who fought its wars, from their first day of service to their last. It had taken 400 years of republican government, a century of civil war, and the most sophisticated political intelligence of the ancient world to arrive at what looks, in retrospect, like a straightforward administrative arrangement. That it looks straightforward is the measure of how completely it worked. Peace arrived in Rome the way most profound changes arrive, not as a single dramatic moment, but as a gradual absence of something that had been present for so long that people had stopped imagining life without it. The civil wars had lasted, with varying intensity, for 100 years. An entire generation of Romans had grown up knowing nothing else. Fathers had fought at Pharsalus, sons had fought at Philippi, grandsons had watched Actium from the Italian coast. The violence had structured everything: careers, marriages, property, survival. When it stopped, really stopped, the stillness was so unfamiliar that Romans initially did not quite trust it. Then, slowly, they began to build their lives inside it. The Senate still met. The consuls were still elected each year and gave their names to the calendar, so that Romans dated documents and events as they always had, in the consulship of this man and that one, a practice unchanged since the founding of the Republic. The praetors still administered justice. The aediles still managed the city's markets and games. The cursus honorum was still climbed by ambitious young men from the right families, who still needed the quaestorship before the aedileship and the praetorship before the consulship. Still spent their 20s learning the machine from the inside, still competed for the offices that their grandfathers had competed for. The Republic's furniture was all still there, polished and arranged, exactly where it had always stood. The house it sat in was different. A senator in the Rome of 10 AD understood his situation with perfect clarity, even if he did not always speak of it plainly. He debated in the Senate, and some of his debates genuinely mattered. The administration of public finances, the governance of senatorial provinces, the management of legal codes that had been accumulating and being refined for 5 centuries. He held real authority in the areas the Principate had assigned to him. He also understood that on the questions that truly determine the shape of the world, military command, foreign policy, the succession, the control of the provinces where the legions stood, one man's judgment was final, and it was not his. He made his peace with this. His father had survived the proscriptions. His grandfather had watched the Senate House burn. A political system in which ambitious men debated in a chamber that stayed standing was, measured against the recent past, an enormous improvement. The equestrian class, the second tier of Rome's property-owning elite, below the Senate but above the common mass, found the Principate more rewarding than their senatorial colleagues. Augustus had expanded the equestrian role in government systematically, placing equestrians in the prefectures that managed Egypt, the grain supply, the Praetorian Guard, and eventually the imperial treasury. These were positions of genuine power, managing the real machinery of imperial administration, without the symbolic weight and senatorial visibility that made the Senate's relationship with Augustus so delicate. Equestrians did not need to pretend the Republic was still functioning. They were simply doing their jobs inside a system that functioned and paid them, and promoted them on merit as much as on birth, which was more than the Republic had ever reliably offered anyone outside a narrow circle of noble families. In the provinces, the change was felt most immediately in the quality of governance. The Republic had sent senatorial magistrates to the provinces for 1 or 2 year terms, men who arrived with minimal administrative preparation, governed through personal staff and local intermediaries, and left behind whatever records they had bothered to maintain. Spectacular corruption was common enough to be a known feature of the system. Cicero's prosecution of Verres for the plunder of Sicily was famous precisely because Verres had been extraordinarily brazen, not because what he had done was unusual. Augustus created a mechanism to investigate and punish provincial governors, placed permanent equestrian officials in the provinces to maintain continuity between governors, and made the extraction of provincial wealth for personal enrichment considerably more difficult and considerably more dangerous. Provincial populations noticed. Tax collection was more efficient, which was unwelcome. Arbitrary expropriation was less common, which was not. You are a merchant in Lugdunum, modern Lyon, in 20 AD. Your grandfather was a Gallic chieftain who fought against Caesar at the siege of Alesia and survived. Your father was born into a client kingdom of Rome and eventually received citizenship. You were born Roman. You run a business trading wine and glassware along the Rhone Valley, moving goods to the Rhine frontier where the legions create a permanent market for everything from grain to luxury goods. The road you use was built by Augustus's engineers, its surface so well laid that a loaded cart moves without the wheel-breaking drama that still afflicts any journey off the imperial network. You pay taxes to Rome, collected by an equestrian official who, whatever his personal feelings about you, follows written procedures that make outright theft a prosecutable offense. You worship at a sanctuary dedicated to Rome and Augustus on the hill above the city. You do not call yourself Gallic. You call yourself Roman. The roads that carried this merchant's wine were the empire's circulatory system, and one of Augustus's most consequential legacies. He inherited a road network that had been built, section by section, across the centuries of conquest, and he systematized it, creating the office of road commissioner, standardizing construction specifications, and funding maintenance from the treasury rather than leaving it to local authorities who lacked the resources to manage it consistently. By the end of his reign, Rome's road network extended 50,000 miles across the empire. Every major city in the western provinces was connected to every other. A message sent from the Rhine frontier reached Rome in roughly a week under good conditions. Goods moved, armies moved, information moved, and all of it moved faster and more reliably than anything the ancient world had previously managed. The Mediterranean itself had been transformed. The Republic's navy had been a periodic improvisation, built for specific wars and allowed to decay between them, and the sea had consequently been plagued by pirates severe enough, at their worst in the 60s BC, that grain ships could not reach Italy safely. Augustus built a permanent navy, 2 main fleets based at Misenum near Naples and at Ravenna on the Adriatic, supplemented by smaller provincial squadrons, and assigned it the permanent task of keeping the sea lanes clear. The result was a Mediterranean that merchants could use with a reliability of safety it had never previously enjoyed. Sea commerce expanded through Augustus's reign and kept expanding through the following century. Roman glass reached India. Indian spices reached Roman tables in Britain. The empire's economy was not simply large, it was connected, in the sense that goods and money moved through it in patterns too integrated to be disrupted by any local event short of a catastrophic war. The literary culture that flourished under Augustus was not accidental. He understood, with the same precision he brought to institutional design, that the Principate needed a mythology. Not a propaganda mythology of crude slogans, but a genuine literature of depth and quality that gave Romans a way of understanding what they were and what the empire meant. He patronized Maecenas, his close friend and cultural impresario, who in turn maintained the poets Virgil, Horace, and Propertius. Virgil's Aeneid, which took the displaced farmer's son from Mantua 11 years to write and was still unfinished at his death, told Rome's founding story through Aeneas, the Trojan exile who carried his father on his back out of burning Troy and sailed west toward the destiny that would become Rome. A destiny that culminated, in Virgil's telling, in the peace and order of the Augustan age. It was the most explicitly political great poem in Western literature, and it was also genuinely great. Horace, who had fought on the wrong side at Philippi as a young officer in Brutus's army, and had survived to become the most celebrated lyric poet of his generation, wrote the Carmen Seculare, the secular hymn, performed at Augustus's great games of 17 BC, which celebrated a new era and a new century. He wrote it as a commission and performed it as a civic act, which did not prevent it from being a genuine poem. The complicated relationship between artistic integrity and political function that Augustan literature navigated was one of the most interesting cultural phenomena of the ancient world. Poets who were not simply propagandists, but who genuinely believed, or half-believed, or wanted to believe, that what Augustus had built was worth having. Horace's famous line, "Carpe diem," seize the day, came from a poem about the unpredictability of human life, written by a man who had lived through the most unpredictable century in Roman history and had survived it to drink good wine on a farm in the Sabine Hills, paid for by the regime he served. The common people of Rome, the hundreds of thousands who lived in the city's insulae, lined up for the grain dole, attended the games, and constituted the crowd that every Roman politician had learned to manage or fear, found in the Principates something the Republic had rarely offered them: consistency. The grain supply was managed by a dedicated prefect who treated its regularity as a professional obligation rather than a political gesture. The Vigili, Augustus's night watchmen and fire brigade, patrolled the city's districts after dark, reducing the catastrophic fires that had always been the great danger of a city built so densely from so much timber. The games were spectacular and frequent. The bread was there. The circus was there. The cynical shorthand was already forming in Augustus's own lifetime, though the poet Juvenal would not write it for another century. Bread and circuses, the twin instruments of managing a population that had traded its political agency for material comfort. Whether the trade was worth it depended entirely on whether you had ever held political agency worth trading. The question of whether the empire was better than the republic it replaced did not have a single answer, because the empire was experienced so differently by different people. For the small farmer in Italy who had survived the Civil War period, the Principate meant roads and markets and the absence of soldiers requisitioning his grain. For the senator whose family had stood at the center of Republican power for generations, it meant dignity maintained at the cost of substance surrendered. For the slave working the latifundia of a wealthy estate owner, it meant almost nothing had changed. For the provincial notable in Gaul or Spain who could now aspire to Roman citizenship, to the equestrian order, eventually to the Senate, the empire was an opportunity the Republic had never offered him. The range of experiences was as wide as the empire itself, which by the time of Augustus's death stretched from Scotland to the Sahara, from Portugal to the Euphrates. The succession that Augustus had managed with such anxious, expensive care for 4 decades worked, imperfectly but sufficiently. Tiberius, his stepson, received the tribunician power in 13 AD, a year before Augustus died, which made the transition as smooth as the system could make it. The Senate voted Tiberius the same powers Augustus had held within days of the old emperor's death. The legions renewed their oaths without incident. The machinery ran. The consulships were awarded, the provinces administered, the courts convened. The grain arrived from Egypt. The thing that had seemed impossible for a century and a half of Roman history, an orderly transfer of power from one ruler to the next, without civil war, without armies marching, without the head of a predecessor on the rostra, happened. Not perfectly, but recognizably, in an institution that had been designed to make it possible. The flaw that remained, the one flaw Augustus had not solved, the one that every Roman historian of his era understood and noted, was the succession itself at the structural level. He had solved the problem for himself by careful management and long preparation. He had not solved the problem in the constitutional sense. There was no law of succession, no clear mechanism by which one emperor followed another, no institution that selected or constrained the choice. What held the system together in the short run was the combination of Augustan precedent, legionary loyalty, and the practical reality that anyone who wanted to challenge the emperor needed an army, and armies had been given very good reasons to stay loyal. What would happen when a bad emperor held the throne, or when competing claimants each had sufficient military backing? That question was deferred rather than answered, and Rome would eventually pay for the deferral. But measured against what had come before, what Augustus left behind was a transformation so complete that it required a new vocabulary to describe it. The men who wrote history in the century after his death, Tacitus, Suetonius, Livy, struggled visibly with the question of how to evaluate a man who had done terrible things and built extraordinary institutions simultaneously. Tacitus, who mourned the Republic with every sentence he wrote, and never quite forgave Augustus for ending it, nonetheless acknowledged that the civil wars had made the Principate necessary, and that what Augustus built had delivered to the Roman world 2 centuries of relative peace and prosperity. Suetonius catalogued his virtues and his vices with the equanimity of a man who understood that both were required to produce the outcome. None of them called him a tyrant. None of them called him a liberator. They called him what he was: the first emperor, the architect of an age, the man who had found a broken world and built something durable in its ruins, even if the ruins had, in some part, been of his own making. The Roman Empire at its height contained roughly 70 million people, a third of the entire population of the world as it then existed. They spoke dozens of languages, worshipped hundreds of gods, farmed climates that ranged from the wet uplands of northern Britain to the baking desert margins of North Africa, and lived under legal systems that varied enormously in their local detail while sharing a common Roman framework at their foundation. No administration in the ancient world had ever attempted to govern anything of comparable complexity. That Rome succeeded at it for 2 centuries, imperfectly, violently at the edges, corruptly in places, but with a consistency of function that no rival state could approach, was not an accident. It was the product of specific decisions made by one man in the first decades of the 1st century AD, decisions whose consequences are still visible in how the Western world organizes itself today. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, lasted from Augustus's assumption of power in 27 BC to the death of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD. 207 years.
It was not a peace in the sense of the absence of all violence.
The legions fought continuously along the frontiers, in Germany, in Britain, along the Danube, against Parthia in the east, suppressing revolts in Judea and elsewhere with a ferocity that left entire populations displaced or destroyed. The peace was not universal, and it was not gentle. What it was, in the precise sense that matters, was the absence of large-scale civil war within the empire. 2 centuries without a Roman army marching on Rome. 2 centuries without prescription lists posted in the Forum. 2 centuries without the particular intimate horror of a political class consuming itself in factional violence. After 100 years of exactly that, 2 centuries of its absence was an extraordinary achievement. The emperors who followed Augustus were not uniformly good. Tiberius governed capably for years and then retreated to Capri, leaving Rome under the de facto control of the praetorian prefect Sejanus in a manner that produced a minor reign of terror before Sejanus's execution in 31 AD. Caligula, who succeeded Tiberius in 37 AD, was murdered by his own praetorian guard 4 years later, after a reign whose excesses became the benchmark against which Roman writers measured imperial dysfunction for centuries. Nero burned, or was blamed for burning, a large portion of the city in 64 AD, persecuted the early Christian community in Rome, and embraced his demise in 68 AD as the legions revolted. The year of the 4 emperors that followed saw Galba, Otho, and Vitellius each seize and lose the Principate in the space of 18 months before Vespasian emerged from the Eastern legions to stabilize the system. Even at its worst, the Principate produced instability that was local, contained, and self-correcting. It never returned to the empire-wide civil war that had consumed the Republic's last century. The reason it held, even through bad emperors, was the institutional architecture Augustus had built beneath the performance of Republican restoration. The permanent legions on the frontiers held their stations because they were paid from a treasury rather than by a patron. The equestrian civil service administered the provinces because it was a professional apparatus that continued to function regardless of who held the throne. The grain supply reached Rome because the prefect of the grain supply had standing procedures and contractual relationships that did not depend on imperial competence to execute. The roads were maintained because road commissioners had budgets and mandates that outlasted any individual emperor's reign. The machine ran because Augustus had built it to run on process rather than personality, which was the single most important thing he had done, and the thing Caesar had most conspicuously failed to do. The succession remained the system's persistent vulnerability, and it produced the Principate's most dangerous moments. When Nero died without an heir in 68 AD, the year of the 4 emperors, demonstrated that the army, specifically whichever legions were willing to march first, was the ultimate arbiter of succession in the absence of a designated heir. Vespasian, who won that contest, solved it for his own dynasty by the straightforward expedient of naming his sons Titus and Domitian as successors, making the hereditary principle explicit rather than decorating it with Augustan fiction. The 5 good emperors of the Nervan-Antonian dynasty, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, solved it differently, each adopting his successor on the basis of ability rather than blood, producing the closest the Roman world came to a meritocratic transfer of power. When Marcus Aurelius broke that practice and left the throne to his biological son Commodus in 180 AD, the consequences were immediate and severe. The pattern was as clear as any lesson history offers. The empire functioned best when succession was planned and institutionalized, and worst when it depended on accident or biology. What Augustus had built was, in a precise technical sense, a solution to the problem that had destroyed the Republic, and only to that problem. The Republic had failed because its constitution was designed to govern a city-state and had been forced to govern an empire, and because the gap between those two scales had produced the structural crack that the Marian reforms had split open and Caesar had fallen through. Augustus had closed that crack by building the institutions the Republic had never possessed: a permanent professional army paid by the state, a permanent civil service, a permanent military treasury, and a permanent system of provincial governance that could absorb the turnover of its human operators without losing its functional memory. He had not built a democracy. He had not built a meritocracy. He had built a machine that could govern 60 million people without tearing itself apart. And in the ancient world, that was enough. The legal legacy of what Augustus built outlasted the empire itself by more than 1,000 years. Roman law, the vast accumulated body of legislation, precedent, and jurisprudential reasoning that the Republic had begun and the empire had systematized, was codified under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century AD into a form that became the foundation of legal systems across medieval and modern Europe. The Justinianic Code, the Digest, the Institutes, these were Rome's intellectual legacy to the Western world, and they arrived via the imperial system that Augustus had created. Property law, contract law, the law of persons, the principles of evidence and procedure that still operate in recognizable form in the legal systems of France, Italy, Spain, Germany, and their colonial inheritors across the globe. All of it traces a direct line back to the legal culture of the Roman Empire, which was itself the product of the institutional stability Augustus had provided long enough for that culture to mature and be recorded. You are a Roman jurist named Gaius, writing in the middle of the 2nd century AD, in the reign of Antoninus Pius. You are probably teaching in a provincial city, perhaps in Asia Minor or North Africa, though scholars have never agreed on where you lived and worked. You are writing a textbook called The Institutes, a systematic introduction to Roman law for students who need to understand how the whole thing fits together. You write in clear, precise Latin, sorting the law into its categories with a methodical intelligence that will be studied for 2,000 years after your death. You do not write about Augustus, or about the civil wars, or about the republic that preceded the empire you were born into. You write about property and persons and obligations and actions, the fundamental categories through which civilized human beings organize their relationships with each other. The world Augustus made was stable enough, and it lasted long enough, that men like you could spend their lives doing exactly that. The physical remains of what Augustus built are distributed across 3 continents and are still in daily use. The Pont du Gard in southern France, an aqueduct bridge built during Augustus's reign to carry water to the city of Nimes, still stands at 50 meters above the river Gardon and is still structurally sound. The road network that Augustus systematized in Italy formed the skeleton of the European road system that persisted through the medieval period, and in many cases underlies the modern road and rail network of Western Europe. The city plans of London, Paris, Vienna, Cologne, Barcelona, and dozens of other European cities preserve the grid of the Roman settlements from which they grew, the street patterns of the Roman imperial period still legible beneath 2,000 years of subsequent construction. The empire's physical infrastructure was not merely durable, it was so deeply embedded in the geography of the Western world that removing it would have required dismantling the landscape itself. The question that every serious student of this history eventually confronts is whether the trade was worth it. The Republic, for all its dysfunction in its final century, had produced something genuine, a political culture in which the governing class was genuinely constrained, in which debate was real, in which the veto was more than a formality, in which no single man held absolute power. That culture had been creative, contentious, and productive of the legal and philosophical tradition that Rome transmitted to the world. Augustus killed it, quietly, with great skill and without ever admitting what he was doing. The Senate that met in his Rome was real in form and hollow in substance. The elections were real in procedure and predetermined in result. The cursus honorum was climbed by men who understood that at its summit waited not power, but the dignified administration of someone else's decisions. The senators who made their peace with this, and most of them did, were not cowards or fools. They were men making a rational calculation in the face of a lived experience that the Republic's admirers in later centuries did not share. Cicero had defended the Republic in prose of extraordinary beauty and had his head displayed on the rostra for it. Cato had chosen a fatal defiance rather than accept Caesar's pardon, and had become a martyr whose martyrdom changed nothing. Brutus and Cassius had fought at Philippi and lost and died, and the Republic had not returned. The senators of the Augustan age had watched all of that, or had been raised by fathers who had watched it, and they understood what resistance to concentrated power actually cost. The accommodation they made was not with tyranny in the abstract. It was with the specific, concrete reality of what the alternative had produced. Augustus himself understood the transaction he had imposed on Rome with a clarity he revealed only obliquely. In his Res Gestae, the account of his achievements that he arranged to be inscribed on bronze tablets and posted outside his mausoleum after his death, he described himself consistently in the language of the Republic: magistrate, servant of the Senate, restorer of the Constitution, holder of powers granted by the people. He never used the word emperor. He never claimed to have replaced the Republic with something different. The document is the most elaborate exercise in sustained political fiction in the ancient world, written by a man who had spent 44 years performing the same fiction in person. And it is also, in its own way, a masterpiece. the final, polished expression of the one idea that had governed everything he had done since he was 19 years old and had read his great-uncle's will in Apollonia. That power in Rome could only be held permanently by a man willing to pretend he did not hold it. Julius Caesar had understood the Republic's structural failure completely and had been unable to disguise his contempt for the performance of Republican normalcy that his position required. He had sat on the golden throne and worn the triumphal toga and accepted the title of dictator for life, and men who had loved him had killed him for it. Augustus had taken the same lesson and drawn the opposite conclusion. Not disguise the power, disguise the disgust. Perform the modesty with total commitment, every day for 44 years, until the performance and the man were no longer distinguishable. That was the distance between them, not in intelligence, not in ambition, not even in the ruthlessness with which they were each willing to destroy their enemies. The distance was in the willingness to subordinate every personal instinct to the demands of the political theater the moment required. The world Rome made under Augustus shaped the world we live in with a directness that no other ancient civilization approaches. The calendar we use is the Julian calendar, adjusted by Augustus's astronomers and modified only slightly by Pope Gregory in 1582. The months of July and August carry the names of the two men at the center of this story. The legal systems of most of Europe, Latin America, and their former colonies rest on Roman foundations. The political vocabulary of the Western world, republic, senate, consul, citizen, province, empire, is Roman vocabulary, adopted so completely that its origins are invisible to most of the people who use it daily. When the framers of the American Constitution designed a Senate, divided executive and legislative power, and worried about the corruption of republican virtue by military ambition, they were thinking in categories that Rome had provided, and that Rome's failure had illustrated with terrible clarity. 5 centuries of republic, 100 years of crisis, 13 years of civil war, and 44 years of one man's sustained, brilliant, remorseless political performance. And out of all of it came 2 centuries of relative peace for 60 million people, a legal culture that still shapes the lives of billions, and a physical infrastructure whose bones are still visible in the landscape of the Western world. Whether that was worth the price of the Republic depends entirely on what you think the Republic was worth, and what you think it had already become by the time Caesar crossed the Rubicon on a cold January morning and said, in Greek, "The die is cast." The Republic was already dead by then. The only question still open was what would be built in its place, and by whom, and whether it would last. It lasted. That is the final verdict history delivers on Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Not that he was good, not that he was just, but that what he built, against all reasonable expectation, endured.